Preface to the English edition. There is a great difference between writing history philosophy and writing philosophy. In the one case, we study the arrows or the tools of a great thinker, the trophies and the prey, the continents discovered. In the other case, we trim our own arrows, or gather those which seem to us the finest, in order to try to send them in other directions, even if the distance covered is not astronomical, but relatively small. We try to speak in our own name only to learn that a proper name designates no more than the outcome of a body of work. In other words, the concepts discovered on condition that we were able to express these and imbue them with life using all the possibilities of language. After I had studied Hume, Spinoza, Nietzsche, and Proust, all of whom fired me with enthusiasm, Difference and Repetition was the first book in which I tried to do philosophy. All that I have done since is connected to this book, including what I wrote with Guattari. Obviously, I speak from my own point of view. It is very difficult to say why one becomes attached to a particular problem. Why was it difference in repetition which preoccupied me rather than something else, and why the two together rather than separately? These were not exactly new problems, since the history of philosophy, and especially contemporary philosophy, dealt with them constantly. But perhaps the majority of philosophers had subordinated difference to identity, or to the same, to the similar, to the opposed, or to the analogous. They had introduced difference into the identity of the concept. They had put difference in the concept itself, thereby reaching a conceptual difference, but not a concept of difference. We tend to subordinate difference to identity in order to think it from the point of view of the concept or the subject. For example, specific difference presupposes an identical concept in the form of a genus. We also have a tendency to subordinate it to resemblance from the point of view of perception, to opposition from the point of view of predicates, and to analogy from the point of view of judgment. In other words, we do not think difference in itself. With Aristotle, philosophy was able to provide itself with an organic representation of difference. With Leibniz and Hegel, an orgiastic representation. It has not, for all that, reached difference in itself. The situation was perhaps no better with regard to repetition. In another manner, this too is thought in terms of the identical, the similar, the equal, or the opposed. In this case, we treat it as a difference without concept. Two things repeat one another when they are different, even while they have exactly the same concept. Henceforth, everything which causes repetition to vary seems to us to cover or hide it at the same time. Here again, we do not reach a concept of repetition. By contrast, might we not form such a concept once we realize that variation is not added to repetition in order to hide it, but is rather its condition or constitutive element, the interiority of repetition par excellence. Disguise, no less than displacement, forms part of repetition and of difference, a common transport or diaphora. At the limit, might there not be a single power of difference or of repetition, but one which operates only in the multiple and determines multiplicities? Every philosophy must achieve its own manner of speaking about the arts and sciences as though it established alliances with them. It is very difficult, since philosophy obviously cannot claim the least superiority but also creates and expounds its own concepts only in relation to what it can grasp of scientific functions and artistic constructions. A philosophical concept can never be confused with a scientific function or an artistic construction, but finds itself in affinity with these in this or that domain of science or style of art. The scientific or artistic content of a philosophy may be very elementary, since it is not obliged to advance art or science, but it can advance itself only by forming properly philosophical concepts from a given function or construction, however elementary. Philosophy cannot be undertaken independently of science or art. It is in this sense that we try to constitute a philosophical concept from the mathematical function of differentiation and the biological function of differentiation, in asking whether there was not a stateable relation between these two concepts, which could not appear at the level of their respective objects. Art, science, and philosophy seem to us to be caught up in mobile relations in which each is obliged to respond to the other, but by its own means. Finally, in this book, it seemed to me that the powers of difference and repetition could be reached only by putting into question the traditional image of thought. By this I mean not only that we think according to a given method, but also that there is a more or less implicit, tacit, or presupposed image of thought which determines our goals and our methods when we try to think. For example, we suppose that thought possesses a good nature and the thinker a good will, naturally to want the true. We take as a model the process of recognition, in other words, a common sense or employment of all the faculties on a supposed same object. We designate error, nothing but error, as the enemy to be fought, and we suppose that the true concerns solutions, in other words, propositions capable of serving as answers. This is the classic image of thought, and as long as the critique has not been carried to the heart of that image, it is difficult to conceive of thought as encompassing those problems which point beyond the propositional mode, or as involving encounters which escape all recognition, or as confronting its true enemies, which are quite different from thought, or as attaining that which tears thought from its natural torpor and notorious bad will, and forces us to think. A new image of thought, or rather a liberation of thought from those images which imprison it. This is what I had already sought to discover in Proust. Here, however, in difference and repetition, this search is autonomous, and it becomes the condition for the discovery of these two concepts. It is, therefore, the third chapter, which now seems to me the most necessary and the most concrete, and which serves to introduce subsequent books up to and including the research undertaken with Guattari, where we invoke a vegetable model of thought, the rhizome in opposition to the tree, a rhizome thought instead of an arborescent thought.